God kind of put that on my heart, and Pastor allowed me to speak. I did not mean it to be a two-part series, but in retrospect, just looking at the way the Sunday morning messages have gone over the last couple of months, and even this morning, I think you're going to see a lot of parallels and applicability from those messages to my message this evening. And really, we started off, and go ahead and put that up, honey. We talked about the different perspectives, like perspectives that the church has about what we called outsiders, and the church's perspective on God, and God's perspective on the church, and God's perspective on outsiders, and really those three parties and how we look at each other. And I'm just going to fly through these and do a quick recap. I'll fly through these, but when you hear me say the term outsiders, and I stole that term from the author, but it's really for lack of a better term, but it's folks that are not going to church regularly, in most cases aren't saved, but not necessarily. And go ahead and go to the next slide. There's some interesting, the demographic or the characteristics of outsiders. Many of them know a Christian personally, most of them. Most of them are even de-churched. In other words, they grew up in church, or at some point in their life were going to church, and they got offended, or sometimes just got on a wrong path, and a lot of times, obviously, young people know if your parents aren't going, it's kind of hard to be going, and so, but at some point, and again, we're talking particularly age group 16 to 29, but their attitude these days is, they like Jesus. They think, wow, Jesus is a really cool guy, but I just don't know about these Christians. And everything I hear about Jesus is really awesome, but everything I see in Christians is really lame or hypocritical or judgmental. And they kind of have, if you try to talk to them, witness to them, they're not very receptive, because they kind of feel like they've heard it. This is the same message over and over. I've heard this already. It doesn't apply to me. Leave me alone kind of attitude. And I think we defined the difference between perception and perspective, just so we don't get the wrong idea, and we're talking appropriate language here. Perception, I think there's certainly not a whole lot we can do about the perception of the church and of God these days, and that's not really our job to do so. We can't control what CNN puts on, and just like I know Randy and I joke, we're from Oklahoma, and if a tornado hits in Oklahoma, they're going to find the biggest redneck you've ever seen, and he's the cover guy for Oklahoma, and well, kind of the same way for the church. If there's somebody protesting a military funeral, and these guys, picketing, and have very offensive language on picket signs, and they do it all in the name of their church. And these are the things that people see on, the headline or on CNN, or somebody commits a hate crime or worship, even terrorism, in the name of a god. And people associate that now with God and all, even Christians. And so perception gets really, really whack. But when we talk about perspective, we're talking about more firsthand experience that people have had. And again, when we're talking about outsiders, again, most of these folks know a Christian personally, so they're watching and listening to a Christian. They've been in church. They've been around Christians throughout their life. Go ahead and we talked again about the different perspectives, church's perspective about what church should be. Go ahead and go on to the next one. Church's perspective on outsiders, and we kind of have this superiority sometimes that we're Christians because we can make the cut. We're more disciplined, what have you, and I don't think we ever tend to say these things out loud, but in the way we act, our behavior, and and how we maybe treat outsiders, or their perspective about how we treat them. This is their perspective. And then God's perspective on the church. He calls us to be in but not of the world, not to conform to the world, to be the salt of the earth, make people thirsty for God, thirsty for things of the Lord, to love our enemies, to be loving people, to be giving people, and to bear good fruit, or in other words, our actions support our words, right? And here's where we kind of left off in December, is this disparity. There's a great disparity between what God sees the church's role as, again, being a loving people, being different, living holy, being a giving people. But this is the perspective that the outsiders have on the church. 91%, 87%, 85%, those top three. So if you were to do a word association game, if you just went out there and did a survey out on the streets of Birdsboro right now and interviewed 16 to 29-year-olds and asked them, tell me the top three things you think of when you think of a Christian, that's more than likely what they're going to say. And then there's, a number of other things that were common responses. So again, just a real disparity. And what I want to do tonight is get into particularly judgmental and hypocritical, and hit on those two in particular. Delve into those perspectives a little more closely, and what we can do about it, quite frankly. When we talk about, let's look at hypocritical first, outsider's perspective, that Christians are hypocritical. Instead of being known for being hypocritical, we really should be known for our transparency. And what I mean by that is our willingness to open up and share our story or our own struggles. And again, I am so guilty of everything you're going to see or hear out of my mouth. I know from firsthand experience how I fall into this trap, but we tend to pretend we have it all together, don't we? And we feel like as Christians, we've got to, some of the expectations that we've got to act like we have it all together, and that we don't sin and we don't struggle with sin. We ought to be known for helping to solve problems. And by that I mean not just being critical and pointing out the faults in others. It's real easy, actually, to find faults. And but what does that do for us? And I'm going to share a story a little later on. We should be known for our actions, not just our words. And let's read a verse from James chapter 2. It says, "You say you have faith, for you believe that there is one God. Good for you. Even the demons believe this, and they tremble in terror. How foolish. Can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless?" In other words, not just enough to talk the Christian talk. Don't you remember that our ancestor Abraham was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered his son Isaac to the altar? You see, his faith and his actions worked together. His actions made his faith complete, and so it happened just as the scriptures say. Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called the friend of God. So you see, we're shown to be right with God by what we do, not just by faith alone. I really see that there's kind of a double jeopardy these days, though, kind of a dilemma in church, and particularly between older Christians and younger Christians. Or you take the same demographic, say age 16 to 29 of Christians, versus the older demographic, let's say 30 and above, or 40 and wherever you want to make that mark. But I think it's safe to say that older Christians tend to emphasize lifestyle, tend to emphasize right living, and avoiding sin, quite frankly, is a measuring stick of spiritual maturity, as opposed to, and really, this is where I think the messages that pastors have been bringing the last couple of months, I think particularly us young people are guilty of being indistinguishable almost from the world, and the behavior of young Christians, statistically, the behavior of young Christians is nearly the same as outsiders' behaviors. And I think this dilemma where you've got Christians, and in particular, when you talk that kind of older group, you're talking about your senior pastors, the talking heads of today's church. They're preaching, teaching, living a spiritual lifestyle, teaching being different, living holy. Yet you've got this the up-and-coming Christians trying to, and I think sometimes coming from a good place in our hearts, but trying to be relevant, trying to relate to the world, and unfortunately sliding on that slippery slope of compromise. Let's go on to the next slide and delve into a little bit more about being the judgmental and our perspective of the outsiders, that we're judgmental. We go ahead and put that quote up there, honey. In these days, let's read Matthew. It says, "Do not judge others, and you will not be judged, for you will be treated as you treat others. The standard," and by the way, this is red font, so this is Jesus talking. "The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, 'Let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye,' when you can't see past the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, get rid of the log in your own eye, then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye." Go ahead and put that next quote up there. "We have become famous for what we oppose rather than who we are for." Another way of saying that, we're better known for what we stand against. And I'm saying we as Christians are better known for what we stand against than what we stand for these days. We talked about, we're called to be the salt of the earth. God says that in His Word, and I've heard, and I think I even a couple months ago preached about what that means, and the metaphors that you can read into salt. But let me ask you this: is it possible to be too salty? Anybody? Not anybody, because my grandfather, who recently passed away, although I don't know if there's any correlation, but he loved salt. Like, there was never such a thing as too salty. But I, for one, would reply, yes, there's such a thing as too salty. Not too much, not too little. Actually, I'm not the right person to speak on salt, because there's no such thing as too little. I could eat without salt. But when you think about, maybe to carry the metaphor even further, of pouring salt in a wound, and how harmful is it to us if we're trying to reach the lost, if we're trying to reach an outsider, and all we do is dig at them and point out their faults, where they're failing, when they well know they're failing, when they well know they may not be meeting the Christian standard, if you will, and yet we're constantly there to judge them rather than be there to help them and support them and be there for them. Judgmentalism creeps in whenever we deal with issues as if they were black and white, rather than flesh and blood humans in need of redemption. I want to read an excerpt from this book. It's chock full of stories. As they went around and did their surveys, they would talk to some of these folks and get personal accounts. And this one's pretty real, pretty raw. It's about a young woman named Lisa, and there's a kind of a dialogue back and forth between her and the author of the book. And Lisa says, "You know what really bothered me?" The young woman, Lisa, confessed during a recent interview. And the author says, "I was grateful for the frank thoughts of this 29-year-old mother of 2 toddlers. Well, you're asking how Christians come across to me. Well, I'll tell you. A few weeks ago, I visited a Christian Bible study at a church. Every once in a while I go because I know a few of the women. You know, I'm still trying to figure out this Jesus thing. After the speaker talked for a while, we started a conversation at our table, about 8 or 9 of us women just chatting away. I was probably the youngest one there, but some of them were about my age. We got along pretty well. What happened that bothered you? Well, we were talking about sex, intimacy, pregnancy, stuff like that. I told them about a friend of mine who was considering an abortion. I told them her entire situation. A 20-year-old boyfriend had left her. She's feeling really alone. I made some comment about really empathizing with my friend and that I could understand that abortion might make sense. I guess that shocked them. I know the women there are pro-life and all. I don't know what I am, pro-life or pro-choice or just myself. But the conversation shifted at that point in a really weird way. Instead of having a dialogue, I was put on the defensive. They were nice enough about it, but the ladies just kept talking at me, trying to fix my attitude about abortion. Lisa paused and softened her tone. And here's the part that really bothered me, something I never told them. What they didn't know is that I had had an abortion a long time ago. It wasn't an experience I would wish on anyone, but I can feel my friend's dilemma because I lived it. I'm not sure the Christians I hung out with that morning get that. I guess the truth is I was hoping for some empathy myself. The reason I picked that one is maybe more so than any other example in the book of it really epitomizes a lose-lose-lose situation. Because I can think of not just one soul, and man, I'm as pro-life as they come, folks. I can't imagine. But again, Christians coming from good places in our hearts. But I think, you know, this is an example where that Bible study was so focused on the one soul, right? The unborn child. And just in their approach, probably failed to reach not just that one soul and save that one soul from death, but probably the mother of that unborn child, as well as Lisa. Wouldn't you say? Couldn't you look at that and say, you know, if the women in that Bible study had just a little bit different approach, a little more care, taken a little more time and engaged a little bit differently in that conversation with Lisa, maybe Lisa invites her pregnant friend, to the next Bible study. You know, maybe her friend gets saved, maybe Lisa gets saved, maybe, you know. Instead, you've got an offended Lisa who probably won't ever go back to that Bible study, probably won't remark highly of Christians to her friend who's contemplating having an abortion. So you see where I'm going? It's just, these are real life scenarios. These are tough to talk about, but this is what we're dealing with. Is it possible that our judgmental attitudes are just posturing to look good to other Christians? Is it possible that part of the reason that Christians have lost their appeal to outsiders is that they've lost their passion for people outside the church? Some suggestions I would have in countering this judgmental perspective would be to talk less